Welcome everyone. This is now the last session of the Better Hospitality Conference. So I hope you've all been enjoying the session so far. I've got here David Chinery and Andre Lussman, and we will be introducing ourselves shortly for this session on multi-purpose spaces and how you can design them for restaurants for different revenue streams. We were supposed to be joined today by James Bates, who sadly can't join us anymore. So very kindly, Andre has jumped into as a fourth cavalry, or I'm not quite sure which number it is supposed to be, the cavalry, but anyway, the kind of emergency forces, and he's going to be talking to you from the restaurant operator perspective. But we actually did fortunately get to speak to James before this session, so we already kind of know what his thoughts were on the subject. So I'm going to be representing James and from the notes that we have from when we discussed before, and Andre is going to be providing his thoughts as a restaurant operator on that as well. So David, shall I hand over to you and you can bring up your slides and we can get started with the introductions?
Absolutely, no problem at all. Okay, you see that okay?
Perfect.
Excellent. Do you want me to introduce myself quickly?
Yes. Do you have yes, exactly. So if you could introduce yourself and then Andre as well, that would be really helpful.
Great. Super quick. So I'm David Chenery, company's Object Space Place. We are sustainable hospitality designers. So obviously mainly involved in designing restaurant spaces and trying to make them work for our clients. Probably a few of you have already seen me in another session, so I think I'll just leave it there, short and sweet.
Thanks, Dominique. Great to have this conference, the inaugural conference. So well done. Not enough of it. So in case I don't get the chance. So good stuff.
Thank you very much, Andre.
My name's Andre Lussman. I don't feel like a veteran, but I have been doing this for 30 years. Lussman's is 20 years old. We have been sustainable from day one, and we have been on a journey for all those years. It's a small group of independent restaurants. We have contracted slightly over the pandemic, but I'm happy to say that we have plans to hopefully grow again this year. So sustainability does live on the high street.
Excellent. I'll just briefly introduce myself. You're probably already sick of my voice and face. But I am the founder of Trident Supplied, which is a purchasing platform that focuses on supply chain and efficiency and sustainability. And we have been organising the Better Hospitality Conference, which I have thoroughly enjoyed myself, and I hope everyone here has as well. So, David, do you want to get started with the slides? And
yeah, absolutely.
I'll do my best to represent what James said. Please don't quote me, but we'll do what we can.
I think we've got enough insight and information to hopefully be helpful to everyone watching, which is surely exactly the only benchmark we need to get to. So, yeah, just thinking about this, obviously we kind of know why we're here, and that's really that everyone has had to react and adjust to the massive disruption of the last year. And I think at this point, Andre, you just touched on it then, but I guess it's worth, from a restaurant operator perspective, reflecting on how you found the disruption and the change and the adaptations you've been looking at to the business in order to survive, I guess, and then moving out of that.
Cheers, David. I think we were all initially overwhelmed by the fact that the tap was turned off, I think 4 days before Boris officially told the country that we couldn't go out. And what was wonderful about hospitality is that we are a very impressive lot in that we are enterprising, we have ingenuity, we have bags of passion, and we think outside the box for lots and lots of reasons. We're not focused on being inside an office and working within our four walls. And I think because we had no money coming in, and we were all rather worried, and to a certain extent, before furlough came along, we were all extremely worried as to what would happen next. Many of us just decided to start thinking about, finding ways to sell food, to engage with regulars. And very quickly in our case, we looked at the NHS after seeing the horrible images before Boris's lockdown of empty shelves, supermarkets empty, because of course restaurants provide such a large amount of food for people to eat during the normal week, because eating out in a restaurant and a pub and etc. is no longer a treat once every month. It's 3 or 4 times a week in the southeast. So in light of that, there was a shortage of food, but restaurants had that food. And with Mother's Day round the corner, we found that a lot of our suppliers had huge amounts of food which was available to them, but they couldn't get it out, to the point where you had black cabbies going to fruit and veg suppliers, and they were delivering boxes of fruit and veg themselves across different counties, which was amazing. So a real sort of warlike spirit that was engulfing most of hospitality. In our case, I think we were just very worried that there was no cash coming in. We had fixed costs that needed paying, and we had no idea who would pay the wages. So we had to find, different tools within the box in which to ignite some sort of sales and revenue streams. And we opened an online supermarket within 30 hours. And a year later, we've pretty much hit 100,000 ready-made meals. And it was a combination of ready-made meals and luxury boxes and gourmet organic burgers and market stalls. But I think we all did what we had to do to a certain extent if we didn't have a large corporate behind us. And that was to survive, give the very good staff that work with us an opportunity to look beyond the horrors of the moment, and feed that bank account with some cash, because unfortunately so many businesses which are so good would have lost out and would have invariably gone into administration simply because, for no reason of their own, they were caught out at the wrong time. And it was very, very sad. So, that disruption meant that Lussmann's, no different to anybody else, which was independent, meant that we had to find ways very quickly to make money. And as I've often said, the art, I think that the embassy of all sustainability comes from being in business, employing staff and raising taxes. It's wonderful to be sustainable, but if you haven't got a business in the first place, then it's all irrelevant.
Absolutely. And I think the interesting thing to reflect on, obviously you've got your experience, it'd be great to get some more about that now, about how you see the opportunities. But a lot of different people we've seen, with obviously hospitality and restaurants come in many different genres and flavors and types and offers. And some of them have discovered that some of those other revenue streams are actually quite profitable for them specifically because of the type of offer that they have. And we can discuss those a bit in a minute. But I guess the question is that there are a number of them, and Dominique, you might want to interject a bit about Murray and what they're looking at doing. But there are some people who've discovered that they perhaps can look at a hybrid business model, or that they have permission to be brave now, and change things that they were looking at before.
I think certainly that was the impression that we got from James, that they'd started the meal kit that they were doing, and they were very happy with them and thinking of continuing them beyond once they were able to reopen. And I think his perspective was that the pandemic had provided an opportunity to reset and reopen with a kind of business model that was adapted. If you'd seen that meal kits were doing well for your business, then that was something that you could move forward with and work on how you could incorporate that better within your business, because his view was that if once you get started, hospitality business is very busy. It's very difficult to change things once you get going, and so the pandemic has almost, as you say, given people the opportunity to be brave and think differently about how they reopen. And I know, Andre, you have a kind of slightly different approach to that. Do you want to speak to the way that you're approaching that?
Well, I don't know so much a different approach. I accept and fully buy into the fact that when you're faced with a life-changing scenario, it is a passport to throw everything out the window and look again. We had no other option but to do that, because usually we're constrained by lots of other, environmental or economical factors, and none of those were there apart from you need cash. And clearly, lots of good ideas will be born from intuition and some smart out off the wall thinking, which will give great revenue streams and give people hybrid businesses. I do feel though that a lot of that will now have to be pared back in order to protect the brand. Remind yourself what you do best. Stick to knitting. There are things that we've been all doing for many years, and we are great ambassadors of, or we are experts in our field, and our staff are professionals in what they do. They might be coming back a little bit flabby mentally, a little bit off kilter physically, but they all get back to it. But I do think from a brand perspective, in the majority of cases, we should maybe release the ego and the lovely comments which are made that make us feel nice, and get back to the stuff that makes real money, because there's no better way to make sure sustainability works than that of a busy restaurant or a busy business. And that's not to say that there aren't hybrid ideas and concepts that have come out of all this. Of course, that goes out saying. But we, after doing 4 or 5 different revenues and making, as I said, 100,000 restaurant, meals to go and all the rest of it, we've now this week stopped everything, and to the dismay of our customers. But it's not long now for them to get back into our restaurants. And we must now focus on, or restaurants and pubs must focus on what they do best, and not get distracted by the sexiness or the ego or the excitement that new ideas bring.
I think that's really interesting as well, because it does remind me of one of my favorite quotes from a guy called Rory Sutherland, which is that the opposite of a good idea can also be a good idea. And I think that speaks very much to what your brand strengths are, and also your kind of ability to make these singular decisions. And I think there is a permission to be brave for some people, and that maybe it's just given people or some businesses the opportunity to question the default. Or if they were struggling a bit before the pandemic actually, and they've realized, actually, hang on a sec, what we do is more geared to this type of service delivery or this type of service delivery. So I think that would be my reflection on that, but I completely accept your both experience and knowledge on that point. It does lead us to this question of, before you do anything, if you were going to design a restaurant space to serve multiple revenue streams, you sure as hell better make sure why anyone's going to come to you in the first place. What is it that they love about you? How are you different? And that can be both a disarmingly simple question and a really difficult one for a lot of people to answer, because it can be a bit like, well, we just do really good food, our service is really nice. A lot of people struggle to get anything meaningful when they answer that question of positioning and understanding what makes them different. But when you can answer that, and there are some different categories we can look at, when you can answer that, it can help you filter out maybe some answers to this question of what should we be doing. So for example, if you are a particularly product-led offer that people come to you specifically for this thing that you do, you probably are quite well geared up to do delivery if the product travels well. Or that might transpose into a retail offer if this is something that's ambient, or you have particular produce you source, that could work quite well. Although, Andre, you were giving an example from Bill's, I think, that actually that wasn't so profitable for them.
Unofficially, and from what I've heard,
we're all friends here.
A lot of big companies, we know that they fill in their spaces with products to create heritage and to deliver a certain experience. And Coluccio, I suppose, was one of the very first to do it rather well in its early days. But I'm on, from good authority, and I don't speak about Coluccio, but I speak about other brands that have done it. They often fail in that it looks nice, but in real terms, who really goes after that particular jam from that particular restaurant company? Unless it is, Ruth Rogers at River Cafe, or going to Murano and seeing Angela Hartnett, which are maybe the very best. in terms of the high street, who goes after these things, and quite often is a distraction because it's very dusty, it might be out of date, it's losing money, there's branding that's required, there's logistics, picking, packing, presenting, delivering, all the things I've learned to do in the last 13 months, which I've never known anything about. But you're quite right. It's something that restaurants haven't done in the past. And I often think that, I've experienced it the last 7 days after not doing it for 13 months, having 30 square meters and 700 covers. To most of us, actually, that's where we make a lot of money very quickly.
No, you're absolutely right.
I sell a lot of jam, and the packaging, the presentation, the communication of that is a job and a half to do it really well and engineer a competitive edge to all your competitors, which I don't think us restaurateurs are very good at, unless you are a little local niche cafe that has a brilliant local following.
Yeah, and I think just again as a counterpoint to that, there's a company called the Real Eating Company that we work with a little bit, and I know within their coffee shops they do have a range, and it's a very small range. It's like 5-6 products that they have been asked about and come from a particular supplier they work with, and they just have this as a range of, in this instance, jams or coffee, and they are positive retail sales that they make in addition, but it's a very tailored range rather than saying, hey, we're basically an Italian supermarket alongside, which, as you say, is a massive thing. So I think retail is part of it. Dine at home kits, maybe master classes. A lot of people have been doing that, whether that is now not just online, but actually people bringing people into your restaurant, which is obviously another thing we can talk about when we get to using spaces across different days. So yeah, if you're product led, I think that you've got certain avenues that are kind of obvious. If you're community focused, I think it becomes a little bit, there are versions of the same thing, but I think within delivery, there's a chance to build up something with more loyalty. There's some interesting people who do delivery with returnable packaging. So they're using the tiffin boxes from Spice Box, I think it is. There's one called what was the name? I think it's called Muvs All Day. It's a Sri Lankan curry concept in glass jars, and you return it. So you're building up this connection with the community because you've got a local following. You can push sustainability in that sense, and you can probably get away from the Deliveroo and those kind of guys in that instance. So maybe delivery starts to make a bit more sense there. And then you've also got the idea of, probably looking at pop-up events outside of the restaurant. So, one of our clients in Cardiff called Nook, they're just taking a little pop-up and doing like Nook by the river. Again, this isn't using your existing restaurant space, but this is dialing back from that first positioning point. Why do people love you? If they love you locally, you can do a pop-up restaurant and do something amazing, right? And that would seem to make sense. Or simply hosting, relevant community groups, doing something there, bringing people into your space. That seems to me to be an intelligent way of looking at the revenue stream if you are a community-focused offer. Brand experience focused ones is a bit more challenging, I think, in some ways. If you sell the experience, as you said, Andre, that's why people come to you, that's what they love, that is hospitality in its purest, simplest form. You can't replicate that in many ways. If you do have a particular type of brand in this brand experience space, this is Kahoot Spa, for example, there are things where revenue streams that might seem more obvious. So you can probably do something with a stronger digital presence. So you could do something and monetize around that. Merchandise probably ties in a bit better because you have a stronger brand, a stronger strength of brand that you could sell. And if you are going to go down the delivery meal kit angle, then you're probably going to try and make these more experiential. So I can't remember the name of it, but there's ones where people have been giving out specific colors of plates, and there's a playlist that goes with it, and they're trying to bring an experience into your home because they are a brand that's bigger than just the food. It's about delivering something. So those are just 3 brief categories of how you might start to look at your positioning and what's relevant to you. Obviously filtered, as Andre said, with the common sense filter of, are you making money? Which I think we should be applying to all of these. So I think once you've understood that and you've got something that works, the question then maybe becomes, how can you use your existing space as intelligently as possible? The lockdown reality of empty restaurants without customers in, thankfully, obviously is going to change. So if you've been using that space front of house to make up meal kits, obviously this is Padella, they do this every day anyway in the morning to make their pasta up before they then cook it. But if you've been using that space and now you're going to have customers coming in, clearly that's not going to work. So how are you going to make that? How are you going to deal with those changes? And I know, Dominique, do you remember James had some big thoughts on that one?
Yeah, James was saying that meal kits actually take up quite a lot of space, and that was a challenge for them reopening. Was where were they going to continue it? You know, if they wanted to continue it, that you know, how were they going to do it? So I don't think, unless you remember, David, I don't think he decided on a solution yet.
No, but I think that the interesting question with meal kits and dine at home as opposed to delivery is that you can do it at different times and then send it out to people during the week. So you could potentially batch your days, your quieter days, say Monday to Wednesday. You'd have more space in the restaurant for doing meal kits, and then you're opened up for service, you know, Thursday through Sunday. Obviously, the main challenge with delivery and takeaway is that your busiest time in the restaurant for service is also going to be your busiest time for delivery orders, which is not really what you want. You want to smooth out that kind of curve, don't you, across the week? So anything you can do, and similarly with masterclasses, for example, if you want to do, you know, fantastic pasta and you want to do pasta making classes, if you can do those, you know, during the week at other times, then you'll be able to spread, you know, the revenue you're going to get across the week. And obviously then there's marketing benefits and kind of brand perception alongside those as well. So I think it was interesting to reflect on how you can spread those activities. Your space, if your space is not going to change and you're not going to go to a central unit and dark kitchen, any of that, because this has gone so well that you're making £1 million a week off of it, whatever, then what activities can you bring in that align with your positioning that can fill in these time gaps? So I think that was quite an interesting reflection. I know James also had a very interesting point, which I wouldn't necessarily have thought of, but Andre, you might have some thoughts on this as well. That there's a staff question here, because the best general manager he had running the restaurant, you know, looking after customers, was also probably the worst at doing delivery kit and meal kits, because the skill set was so different. And he said it would almost be better to employ an Amazon, you know, warehouse worker to do the meal kits as opposed to somebody used to running a restaurant. So as well as the time issue, I guess the question of staff, right? I mean, how did you find the process of staff skills and staff involvement and changing?
Yeah, these are all big time, tangible, you know, concerns that you've got to be aware of. And I think the first thing is, and I said this morning in another session, is that we have staff coming back, and for a very long time, hospitality, the home from home for our customers is actually the home from home for our staff. And there's no better relationship than this extended family that the restaurant has, or the pub or hospitality provider has. And with furlough, you've now got this massive stake in the ground, whereby you've got those which have been furloughed, and in the eyes of those who've been working all the time have done nothing, they've been lazy, and those which have been furloughed, in their eyes, the staff who've been working have been very lucky, and they've been paid more money than they have. So there's this chasm and this little bit of a disjoint situation going on. And I fear that you've got to be aware of how do you get your staff to be on point and fresh and ready for the challenge ahead. And surely, as we come back, as we noticed with Eat Out to Help Out in the summer, the businesses that we run, if we do the basics right, will be very, very busy just staying normal, just doing your normal stuff. So I think you've got to be very careful. And in light of Deliveroo, and we've never done deliveries during peak times, because as we all know, or any time, because people want to eat your stuff when your restaurant's at its peak and your staff already at a high pressure. So I think that's madness, apart from the fact that does your food, you know, carry well and everything else. And in terms of the boxes and the meal kits are great, but quite often that requires fresh food that is prepared, you know, within a 2 or 3 day shelf life, unless it's done differently. And that always needs to be done, you know, ready for the weekend. So all of a sudden you find that you've got busy, full restaurants, you've got very little space, and putting meal kits together, again, is another stress and a pressure. We found it very easy looking after all these customers doing food to go across the different revenue streams, because we had, you know, large spaces that were air conditioned and that were perfectly designed for us to do this. Now that we're getting back to what we do best, I've had to knock it on the head, because it's just putting that level of stress and pressure on top of a staff force or a team across different restaurants that are already, I fear, against the wall. They're already, finding it difficult to come back because they're just mentally and physically not there. And I think our focus should be very much with our staff and with the business in hand. I'm not saying we ought not to do anything else, but you've got to really know that you can cope with the extra stress and pressure. Otherwise, something will break, and then you really find yourself in more hot water after what has been 13 months of controlling, getting money through and cash flow, keeping the business going. You've done all the hard work, and now is the time to enjoy the wonders of this hedonistic summer that's coming towards us.
Yeah, do you think that the hybrid business model will be more of a minority situation?
A lot of customers have said, why have you stopped? And of course, it's very hard not to engage with their love for what you're doing, and for it to make your ego feel, lovely and everything's wonderful and we're all friends, and why not? But then you have to say, hang on a minute, hang on a second, thank you. And then in a cold light of day, get yourself a cup of coffee and think about the bionics of what you're doing. I think that boxes actually might stay for a certain while. There's lots of people who can't get tables. They have maybe people just shielding. They actually can't be bothered to get out of their pajamas and fancy something a bit different. Let's be honest, you go to a hotel, how often do you have a hotel service upstairs and have dinner, and you don't go to the local restaurants? All the time. From what I understand. So I haven't been to a hotel for a long time. So in light of that, I reckon things like boxes will continue in some form, and we're going to bring them back. And various other types of event that, David, you reeled them all off brilliantly. I feel that if you run a restaurant, it's about saying, can you take your brand, your product, and port it outside your four walls, into people's gardens, into the cathedral, into the marketplace, and do it that way, as opposed to trying to fill your own restaurant with things that you're not sure about, unless what you're doing isn't working. By all means, then change it all. But most of us need to be very wary of the distraction, because if I listen to my customers, I'd carry on with everything, and I fear that I would fall over and end up ruining everything.
I think that point is very valid, Andre, about not trying to do too much at one go. And restaurants have diversified during a time when they weren't doing their core business. Now they're starting to do the core business again. I think what's interesting about what James was saying, taking this opportunity to think differently, it's almost perhaps an opportunity to plan in, as you're saying, we want to bring the meal kits back, but we want to bring it back when we're ready to bring them back. It's taking what we've learned from the pandemic about additional things that we can do and that customers enjoy, but planning in, when it makes sense to bring them back, bearing in mind all the other challenges that are going to be, there during this summer.
I think, as David said, you get back to what you should be doing, and then you then reflect and say, right, there's a space there that's available. There are hours in the payroll that give us some flexibility. I give you one example. I was doing 70 deliveries a day, and I've never delivered anything in my life until lockdown. And on day 1 and 2, I was doing it with a map and a phone and a co-driver, and it was a disaster. It was like I was shouting and screaming. It was like the Paris-Dakar rally gone wrong. It was just a comedy of errors. Day 3, someone said, there's this thing called Google Maps that you put in the addresses, and it creates a route for you. And I was like, oh my God. And that day, we found something that made our life overnight a success. And it's a bit like this, is that you have to say to yourself, right, before we do something without understanding what the terrain is like, we should recognize, is there a demand for it? Like in any business, before you set up any satellite business, is there a demand for it? And how do we make sure the ergonomics and the staff are able to push that through in a consistent manner? When you are quiet and doing 3 boxes, will those 3 boxes be as good when you're doing 450 boxes? We all know that 500 boxes, all the staff are there, brilliant. Same as a restaurant, when you've got 3 covers, and that's when the complaints happen. Saturday night, 200 covers, everyone's having a great time, everyone's switched on, there's no issues. It's the same in this respect. You will make mistakes when you least expect it, when you're quietest. And that's when your brand starts to fade, because people think, let's go somewhere else. In my opinion.
No, I think that's all really interesting. I think that this is the point. I mean, the whole talk's about how to design spaces for new revenue streams, but you need all of this context before you even get there. The design bit's relatively straightforward, but the question about whether you're making the right decision is actually the harder one. But in terms of design, if you've gone through all those hurdles and established that there is some routes that do work, how are we going to adjust the spaces? So I just wanted to touch on a few things that I would be thinking of. Obviously, you need your space to be as flexible as possible. So if you have, if you're putting in large booth seats like this, that's not really going to give you the flex you need to adjust your offer as you move forward. So I think on the flip side of that, though, you also want to avoid any kind of seating layouts that feel like an empty canteen. I mean, there is nothing more sad in the world than walking into an empty restaurant without any people in it. And I think if we need to look at spaces that can evolve and be used differently at quieter times of the day, we do need to think from a design perspective. There's a few things that we need to be aware of. Number one is actually acoustics. So if, for example, you start doing masterclasses or group meetings and things like that in your space, the acoustics in an empty restaurant are often horrible because we rely on other human beings to absorb the sound and break up the echo. So what you might want to start looking at doing there is actually, we were looking at a concept for an art gallery restaurant last year, and we were just looking at very simple, heavy set curtains that could be moved around to help visually divide the space so that people don't feel like they're walking into this cold space, and create some intimacy, but also break up the sound waves there. So acoustics is something you really need to pay attention to. Also lighting, because the lighting requirements will vary depending on the task that you need to do. And this is particularly the case if you are used to doing, a large number of evening services where you've got the ambient lux level down to 150, 200 lux, or you've got candles on the table. Again, and then you might have your kind of house lights that come on for cleaning at some point. Those are going to be really bright and your other ones are going to be too low. So you're going to have to look at the lighting to make sure that you've actually got the right type of lighting for the task that you want to do. With regards to adjustable tables, I think the simple things like having lay-on tabletops that you can bring in, particularly if you're bringing prep out from the kitchen for meal boxes and stuff, you need a hygienic surface, don't you? So you're not going to be using the same tables as outside. So I think lay-on tabletops seem like a really smart thing to be bringing in as well. If you're going to be trying to encourage your cafe restaurant as a bit of a work from anywhere base in terms of having people come in, you've really got to be aware that the requirements for people doing that are much different to a kind of classic restaurant seat. Anyone that's spent any time, I'm sure like most restaurant owners, sitting in their, in their own restaurant at their table and chair on a laptop for 5 hours trying to look through the accounts knows they don't really work so well over that period of time. It can be quite uncomfortable. So we need to think about maybe different types of chairs or how those chairs are going to work. How can we actually make them feel like social environments as well? I think if people are staying there, obviously Wi-Fi and power is massive as well. But there's other things like glare, glare onto screens. We need to give consideration to those. So it does need a bit of a sense of consideration rather than, I think, just having, hey, we've got a power socket here next to this table, you can sit here. It just feels a bit weird and also potentially changes the customer experience overall. Would you consider grouping those people together so you've got a bit of a space in your restaurant where you do this or your cafe, so that everyone else didn't feel weird for not working? So again, just a few of the considerations there. And then the final one is actually around table height. Classically, a perch height table is 1100 millimeters from the ground. So that'd be your classic bar stool. And if you are a member of staff serving on a counter, your counter would normally be about 900 millimeters. Table height is 750. So there can come a problem with some of the table heights if you have something at 1100 millimeters. And you want to use it for kind of bar stools and stuff, but then you also want to use that as a prep space, for example, in your restaurant. That's going to be too high for your staff ergonomically. So what you can get, there are mid-height bar stools that they're called, and they work well with table heights up to 1 meter. And 1 meter is also the kind of the top you'd want to go for a surface that your staff are also going to prep on or work on. So that's a kind of little tip if you're looking at that flexible high stool area, to actually do it at 1 meter high or 1,000 millimeters rather than 1.1, because ergonomically the other one just doesn't work. And that was, I think that was the main thing around design. And the final thing I wanted to touch on here was actually around, depending on how big a part of your business this hybrid is, do you dare to future-proof? I think there are people like Costa Coffee who brought in entirely new shop fronts to deal with a takeaway grab and go versus a walk-in. This is a concept we did last year as a kind of fantasy project, looking at how you might deal with social distancing. So the coffee shop was called Antisocial because most coffee shops, you don't want to speak to other people anyway. So we looked at the idea here of separate entrance and exit, and also having a grab and go hatch to minimize the negative effect on the customer experience. And this also applies to delivery drivers, etc. If we want to keep them out of the restaurant, it's a bigger move. It will only be right for a few people. But I think where you rely heavily on that type of trade, if you think that's a core part of your model, there is a chance to do something a bit different now. And actually, the good thing about doing it around your shop front is that it's the biggest billboard you have in terms of communicating this change of offer to your prospective customer.
I know, David, I was on another call where Hoppers in London were saying that kind of almost more by luck than judgment, they had incorporated a hatch into their design for the restaurant for delivery takeaways. They hadn't actually planned. They opened before the lockdown, and they hadn't actually planned to do takeaway, but it obviously happened, and they were very grateful to the fact that they'd got this hatch set up so that it was really easy to manage that. And also, moving forward, they can see that as a very strong part of their business. But it's not going to impact on the experience of the dine-in customers, because it's a completely separate channel, and the delivery drivers don't have to come into the restaurants, and that was designed into the restaurant from the start.
Yeah, and absolutely. I say some will be luck more than judgment. Some it's just working with what you've got as much as anything. I think it's merely a case that for the percentage of people where they want to embrace this hybrid way of working, that there's an important way almost of cementing that, isn't it, in your customers, kind of customer expectation. So it's going to be interesting as well to see, I think, how people do adjust and react. I think in the next 3, 6, 9 months, we're going to see some turbulence and up and down and then settling, and there'll be some interesting cases coming out of that, I'm sure. Andre, it looked like you were shaping to interject.
No, I was just thinking about the use of space, and I suppose it's also one must be mindful not to try and be all things to all persons, because I've seen that many bars and restaurants I've seen whereby they put in a small bar in the wrong place. It becomes the hive of activity to the point whereby all the diners around are then overwhelmed by the noise and by what seems to be very antisocial. And that, again, if you want people to work in your space, you have to ask yourself, what happens if too many people work there? And what happens if they spend too long there? And then that's when you start thinking, as you know, David, how long do we want them to stay there? How comfortable do we want the chair to be? Because if the chair is not comfortable enough, then they won't spend long enough there. So, it's like Gales. You go to Gales and it's quite pared back, and it's not Cromwellian, but it certainly isn't luxury. It's nice and very middle class, but you wouldn't spend too long there because you're very close to other people. You're at a very small table. You are not totally comfortable. It sort of says, you can come and do some work here, but don't get too snug because you're not going to get comfortable. So I think, we have to, as business people, consider what sort of customers we want and where do we want, and do we want them, as much as we sometimes think we do, because invariably, if we're not careful, it might overwhelm. Noise and acoustics is a very good one with families. We are family friendly, but we're not children orientated, and there's a fine balance. I've always been of the understanding that children are the responsibility of the parents, God forbid, and they should sit at the table. I have my own kids, and and I know the struggles, but it's all about the other diners and the other relationships you have around the tables and whether those people come back. And if so again, the design of the restaurants, if you have lots of glass and steel and marble, and you go back to the mid-90s, what Pizza Express was doing with no acoustics, then it just becomes like a swimming pool. And invariably, those who want to spend money invariably don't come back. And those who want to leave a mess invariably come back. So, I mean, I'm generalizing, but from a purely financial perspective, you have to be very careful as to what sort of customers do you want, and who do you want to stay in your business, and who do you want to spend money. And we're not about being a luxury brand. We're about being something which is classy but classless, much more egalitarian. But I still feel you have to be aware more than just thinking, I want people to do business in here because we're quite quiet at certain times. Because I've seen people have cafes that then become overrun with iPads, Apples and phones. And then all of a sudden, it loses its generation because of money, because they're only buying 2 coffees. And you think, God, that space is really now gone the other way. So it was it's not me going against what you're saying, David, but it's just
no. I think it's all they're all really, really valid points. I think it's I think it's everything you say is completely valid. I don't think it's a problem. As I say, I think that still I genuinely believe that for the majority of hospitality businesses post lockdown, the traditional model will still be the best one, but there will be a minority where a big flip and change in the business model is actually the best move for them. And there will be, I guess, a minority where a hybrid mix of something, a different combination that they found works, will also be the right thing. But no, I don't think that takes away from your point at all. Not at all.
I think there's also an element that, from a resilience perspective as a business, it's good to be able to have access to different revenue streams, even if you decide to turn them on and off as and when you want them. But I think a lot of what we learned through the pandemic was kind of slightly through stress and having to just deal with it. And I think to some extent, just maintaining those skill sets, the understanding of how it works, even if it's not the core part of your business, is probably a good thing, to keep access to, just because we don't know really how stable things will be, and I hope things will be stable. But we don't even know whether 10 years time we might be facing another pandemic, and so I think a lot of these everything that we've learned this year is great to be able to kind of bear in mind and hang on to from a knowledge perspective. Andre, I think you were a bit quiet. Were you trying to comment on that, or?
No, I agree. I'd go on to say that these talents that we have exposed in our businesses, and these wonderful staff that have demonstrated resilience and entrepreneurship and intuitive thinking, and we've all pivoted, which is all wonderful. But I think that whatever we carry on doing, again, we have to err on the side of caution in that customers don't like you changing your mind all the time. So in that space and that product and that revenue stream, if you're going to carry on, then you can't decide to carry on for another 2 weeks and then stop and then bring it back and then stop again, because customers are lost very quickly along the way. And you might think that you're getting through to them, but I don't think we are always getting through. We have so many different channels of communication and so many different layers of media compared to 40, 30, 20 years ago, where we wrote a letter and that was it, or we had a conversation. Today, we have to be able to compete and communicate on so many different levels. And that is obviously understood and appreciated. But actually, customers, I fear, are very busy and they turn off. And actually now, with less that's going on in terms of multi business streams, there's probably a time to say, hang on a second, do we now need to email? Do we need to communicate every week? Do we need to knock on their door every moment? Do we need to just stand back a minute and give everyone some breathing space? Because there might be an overload and people do want to sort of feel as though, hang on a second, I've had enough now. I've heard enough about you and Lusmans and this and boxes and burgers. Jesus Christ. I mean, we had customers this weekend, same customer. The kids came for gourmet organic burgers on one day. They had a box at the weekend for 6, and then they had lunch on the Friday with their girlfriend. I mean, I'm like, and they said, I said, you're eating with us too much. I mean, we can't keep you excited all the time. I mean, you need to give us a break. The whole idea is that you lose fans, maybe once a week if we're lucky. 3 times in a weekend is, even by my standards, is too much. So, it's funny, but I think
we have a good problem there, Albert.
No, it is, but I think that
first world problem, that one.
Yeah. I just think it's almost as though maybe pare it back and carry on with something on a small way that you can control. And if there's a continual support for it and demand for it, better that one grows rather than pares it back. Because I've been paring back food to go the last 2 or 3 weeks, and from 20 grand a week, whatever it is, down to 3 this week, and it's it's like the embers. It's a dying heart or something, and it's horrible to see the staff are depressed and the customer not buying into it. And you have to remind yourself, actually, it's not you, it's not your brand, it's not the product. It's the simple fact, as I said earlier, there's other stuff going on, and you're not the center of their world. No worries. So let's try and get so it's not a bad thing to get back to what you were doing before.
Yeah.
Oh. Have you still got Andre, David, or have you lost him?
No, he's frozen in mid-thought. We'll stick with that piece, I guess.
And obviously, from this, and that's called business, and that's fair enough.
Andre, I think you just cut out in the middle of that, but we've got you back now, so that's good.
Somehow the point still made sense, even though we missed the middle 10 seconds. So nailed it. We lost him again. Should we go to Hannah's question?
Yes, I was just going to.
I forgot what I said. So
it was profound, I bet.
I was just going to wrap up briefly the conversation and then turn to Hannah's question. Very good point, David. What I wanted to say was, we started this whole conversation with James as well around designing multi-purpose spaces for restaurants. And I think the main thing that came out of it was how integrated it is with also thinking about the timing of everything. And when you've got opportunity to use space and access, do your team have time? And are they well placed to do the kinds of business models that you're looking for? Do they have the right skill sets? Do you need to kind of hire specific people for different business models if you're really, if one is really taking off for you? And I think, to both Andre and James made the same point, you also have to think very carefully about what exactly is it that you do, and what do you also like doing. Some people don't particularly enjoy doing the kind of less customer orientated meal box side of things, and that, I think that was for me, just a really interesting perspective on the whole topic. So would you agree with that, David, or did you want to add anything?
No, that's good. I mean, happy with that.
Perfect. Okay, so Hannah has a great question for you, David. Moss are front of house focused. Are they? Oh, sorry, I think that might be most. Most front of house focused. Are there any?
Talk about Moss if you want, but I think it will be less relevant to the conversation. Yeah. Are there any suggestions for redesigning back of house?
That's it. Yeah.
I mean, we don't. The kitchen design always tends to be done by a specific kitchen catering design contractor, but one of the problems with most kitchens is, particularly in London, is that they're bloody tiny, and they're designed. You want to give as much space over to the customer as possible, and the staff always end up with the kind of the dregs of space that is left operationally. So no, I've got no experience of of how you would adapt those. But I guess it would be a case of if you were doing things moving forward. I remember when we were designing for Chipotle, when they first came over to the UK, they have, so this was a separate makeup line for their orders coming in. So if they had fax orders back in the day, phone orders, and then obviously email, they actually had a second line set up just to deal with that number of that line of the business, so they could deal with that. So they already had this sort of set up. So I guess if you were going to make changes, you would want that space, but you'd need to know about that at the beginning rather than probably adapting the space you've got. I think some people are looking, adapting, increasing the kitchen size, but you can only do that if you can sacrifice the front of house space, which in most instances I don't think many can. But I think there are also there's a new hospitality catering company launching tomorrow called Canned with a K, run by a guy called Nigel Thomas, who used to be from Chef Line, and I understand the whole thing is around sustainability. And from a brief conversation with him, he was talking about some of these modular elements that they're creating, where it can be a fridge, or it can be an oven, or it can do all kinds of things. So I'm going to guess there's going to be some stuff in there about the modularity and flexibility that would allow you to adjust the operation across the course of a day. And that's just, I've only had a quick half-hour conversation with him, and he hasn't sent me anything because he's launching it tomorrow on Earth Day. So there may be something interesting there about flexibility of back of house, but we'll see.
There was an interesting comment by Professor Spence yesterday in the experiential dining session around designing kitchen spaces for mental well-being, and kind of making sure that there's more light in kitchen areas. I mean, he gave a good example of a kitchen on a rooftop, but that was, that was a kind of extreme example. Mostly he was talking about, open kitchens as opposed to closed kitchens, where, typically your front of house space does have more access to natural light. And that has an impact on people's well-being and productivity. But having an open kitchen from a multi-purpose perspective is also quite interesting, because you have the opportunity to do things like masterclasses using the open kitchen as well, and that could be in person or filmed as digital masterclasses. So I think that open kitchen layout could potentially have benefits.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to Pizza Express in the mid-90s, they did something which was, they had design and ergonomics, and they put the pizzeria counter in the middle of the restaurant, which hadn't been seen really, and it was quite simple. Hello? Hello?
We've got you back, Andre. Yes, we have.
Sorry, I just think, well, just sum up, I mean, you're right, space and light, and I think the closer the kitchen is to the front of house team, the better. So they can make them coffees, they can see the type of trade coming in, and they have a relationship which is less about front of house and back of house and more about a united team. And every restaurant we've tried to take over, or we've bought into, we've tried our best to try and bring that kitchen, which is usually in the bowels of the business, into some sort of space that gets much closer to the staff in terms of being a complete unit rather than them and us. So that's a really important point, I think, in terms of chefs' relationships in the business.
Yeah. David, I wanted to ask you a question, because I know you did a lot of work, and we're talking earlier about the circular design and trying to make restaurants give more than they take, and how you can reuse or create a restaurant that can be dismantled.
Yeah.
It's designing for dismantling it, because you know that restaurant spaces are likely to change, whether that's because the restaurant itself wants to change the concept, or whether that's because they're moving out and somebody else is coming in. Do you think that building in that kind of dismantling into the design has gives you greater flexibility from a multi-purpose perspective as well?
I mean, 100%. I think it will do. I say we haven't got an experience of having to take apart a restaurant that we have designed as yet, because the arc of completion is obviously not that fast. But yeah, 100%. I mean, I always historically as a designer, years ago, I would always push back a little bit against clients that wanted flexibility in their design and operation, because I'd always give the analogy that we want to create the best customer experience possible. And if you want something that does many functions, like a penknife, it's going to end up looking like a penknife, because that flexibility will drive the aesthetic, because it's got to do too many things. So you're going to have a less unique, more generic finish as a kind of end product. But I've come around since looking at circular economy and sustainability more, that actually as designers we've just got to find a way to solve that problem, because that flexibility, not having that flexibility, is kind of unforgivable. I've had clients in the past, you put something in, it's beautiful, and then they want to change something, and then it's really hard, or they have to throw something away, or buy something new, or spend another $3,000 on something, and that's just not really on, is it? It doesn't stack up. So I think, designing for disassembly and flexibility are core ideas that we need to bring in to make these sorts of transitions easier in the future. If you go in and you've got an existing restaurant, I'm sure Andre will tell you, having taken over a few of them, they can be really hard to knock about and change, because, you try and take a counter out and move it and they'll fall to bits, or they'll crack, or, all kinds of stuff will happen.
Yeah.
And, I've designed those because I just wasn't thinking, in the past, it was just like, all the commercial pressures of designing a nice restaurant that gets open. So yeah, it is a challenge, and it is one that we need to, deal with. It's just got to involve more screws and less glue, basically.
Yeah, I do think that creating, one of the things that came up yesterday was experimentation, and how important that is to getting it right when you're starting. I mean, once you've got a well-oiled operation like Lissman's that knows what it's doing, then it's you don't have to experiment quite as much.
But I mean, I would say that the most sustainable thing you can do, if I'm not breaking up, hopefully.
Yes, you're
the
good.
most sustainable thing you can do, I think, to begin with, is to take over someone else's restaurant and run with it. You don't, unless you are living in Notting Hill and you've got loads of money, you don't buy someone else's house and start again. Well, you might do that in Harpenden, but most of us buy someone else's house, we live in it, and then we put we gloss it up with our own colors to give it a cosmetic makeover, nothing much there. And then in time, we suddenly realize this space needs to work better for me because I've got ideas and I feel confident and comfortable. And I think the most sustainable thing we can always do is say, let's live with what we've got. As David said yesterday, change the toilets, make sure the ceiling looks great, good doorknob and great cutlery, and with charming staff, you're there or thereabouts. Customers will certainly appreciate what you're doing. And then in time, when cash flow is strong, then start to move things around, because so many people spend millions of pounds on restaurants, forgive me, and close them because it's quite often for the wrong reasons and with the wrong values. And I said yesterday, less is more. You go on a walk, if the bigger the rucksack, the more stuff you put in it. So if you can, I love the fact that I only have a quarter of what most people spend on a restaurant design, and I have to use my imagination to use what's in that building to begin with. And I fear that that's sometimes not talked about enough. It's just utilizing, not recycling every table and chair, but utilizing what the footprint of that building has to say. And uncovering beautiful features that might not have been noticed.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap up because I'm responsible for starting the wrap up and the cocktails now. Do please join us for Richard Maxted from Mix and Muddle is going to be doing a wrap up cocktail shake along for everyone. I hope you really enjoyed all the sessions. So see you hopefully in the cocktail in a moment.